Good day, everybody. This is Julio Dalla Costa again with our accounting advisory hot tips. Today, we're talking about the lease adoption of ASC 842, the new lease accounting standard. Today, we're going to talk about a very important component of your lease adoption journey, which is some of the more critical practical expedients that you're allowed to take to make your transition easier. So we're going to talk today about the group of three, short-term leases, low-value assets, and lastly, lease versus non-lease components. Let's get right into it because there's a lot to cover. The first one that the FASB has allowed is the group of three. So basically, lessees and lessors are permitted to make an election to apply a group of three practical expedients as a group. You cannot take one, you have to take all three. So what are they? The first one is whether a contract contains a lease or not. So if you've already done your analysis under the previous accounting standard before 842, then you're allowed to assume that I have already reviewed all my contracts that have leases. So I don't have to go back and look at contracts to say, did this contain a lease or not? So that's a very good practical expedient because it allows me to just assume that I've already done it correctly. The second one is I don't have to go back and reassess whether I have an operating or finance lease. And the third one is whether I have an IDC that qualifies for capitalization. So what does that mean exactly? So I don't have to go back and look at my old contracts to understand whether I have a finance and operating lease. And then I don't have to go back and say whether I should have capitalized my initial direct costs. So in my previous assessment under ASC 840, I would have already done that. So I do not have to go back and reassess whether I have already capitalized or not capitalized. So if I have to take those three, it significantly reduces the amount of rework I have to do because it means I don't have to go and review my old contracts for whether they contain leases. I don't have to reclassify any operating or finance leases, and I don't have to go back and check whether any IDCs were capitalized or not capitalized. So that's a very helpful practical expedient. The next one is short-term leases. As far as the FASB is concerned, a lease that is 12 months or less does not need to be capitalized. So we get a lot of questions from customers saying, I have a 6 months lease for a coffee machine. Do I have to capitalize it? And the answer is no. If a lease is on the initial signing on that contract is stated as 12 months or less, you do not have to capitalize it. So it will continue to be expensed as debit lease expense, credit accounts payable in this scenario. Be very careful about renewal options. If I have a 12-month lease and I have a renewal option for another 12 months, and I know on day one that I'm going to renew that, then it doesn't become a 12-month lease. It's actually a 24-month lease. So be very careful when you adopt these short-term leases because your auditors will want to understand how did you assess renewal options as far as short-term leases. The third practical expedient is low-value assets. We get a lot of questions about, since I have a threshold for capitalization on my property, plant, and equipment, can I use the same threshold for leases? And the answer is yes. Now, even though in the original standard, the FASB has not commented on this, in the basis for conclusions, BC 122 basically states that it is reasonable to assume that there will be a threshold in order to capitalize a lease. So let's say I have a copy machine that is less than $5,000 and I use $6,000 to capitalize PP&E. In that scenario, I will not need to capitalize that copy machine because it's below my capitalization threshold for my company. Very important practical expedient. The last one I wanted to talk about, which is a very critical piece of it, is whether you're going to group lease versus non-lease components. In that scenario, in any lease contract, you may have a lease component or you may have a non-lease component. So some examples may be, if I have a lease and I'm paying utilities, or I'm paying CAM, or I'm paying other things that are not related to the actual lease of a space or lease of a piece of equipment. In that scenario, the FASB has allowed me to say, instead of trying to bifurcate based on standalone selling price of a utility versus the piece of equipment, or maybe it's included for gas charges or usage charges, the FASB says you can take that one payment by combining lease and non-lease components as one lease expense. And that is very important because it saves a lot of time, because I don't have to assess how do I bifurcate these based on fair value or based on standalone selling price. Another very critical practical expedient. With that said, we have recapped all the critical practical expedients under the lease adoption for ASC 842. I hope it was helpful for you, and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us at bramasol.com. Thank you.